32, my Amish mother-in-law tested me as a wife before I had healed from giving birth. It's 3 in the morning and I'm alone, except I'm not. The baby is at my breast and my body is still bleeding through pads I change every hour. The stitches pull when I move. My mind is so foggy I can't remember if I fed her on the left side or the right. The house is dark except for the pale moon through the window. And through that same window I can hear my mother-in-law moving in the guest room down the hall. She arrived 3 days after my daughter was born to help. But that first night, alone in the darkness with my baby, I realized she was there to watch. I didn't know what she was testing yet. I just knew I was being seen. I'm Sarah, and if you're new here, this is where I share what it really meant to be a woman in my Amish community. I talk about the moments that shaped us, the expectations we carried, and what it took to hold on to ourselves. If this resonates with you, subscribe and tell me. Have you ever felt tested by the people who were supposed to help you most? The first week after my daughter was born, I existed in a state between sleeping and waking. My body was broken open in ways I hadn't been prepared for. One had warned me about the bleeding, how heavy it would be, how it would soak through everything, how my legs would feel weak when I stood up too fast. My stitches ached with every movement. When I walked to the bathroom, I had to hold the wall. When I sat down, I had to lower myself slowly like an old woman. I was 22 years old, and my own body had become something I didn't recognize or trust. My mother-in-law arrived on day 3, her arms full of casseroles and her expectations full of something I couldn't name yet. She said she wanted to help. What I felt was being studied. She moved through our house like she owned it, the way she inspected the laundry I'd left to soak, the way she opened cupboards and rearranged things without asking, the way her eyes followed me from the kitchen to the living room. At night, I could hear her moving in the guest room, the footsteps deliberate, checking on things. She was always watching, and I was too tired, too sore, too confused by the hormones flooding my body to push back. Everything felt like it required an argument, and I had no strength for arguments. I just wanted to survive the next hour. I wanted my body to stop hurting. I wanted to understand what my baby needed when she cried. My mother-in-law's scrutiny felt like one more weight I couldn't put down, but I thanked her anyway, because that's what we were taught to do. The first real moment came on day 5. I was feeding my daughter on the couch, and my mother-in-law commented on how I was holding her. "You're cradling her too high," she said. Just those words, simple words. But the way she said them with such certainty, such authority, made me question every choice I'd made since my baby arrived. Had I been holding her wrong? Was I hurting her? I shifted how I held my daughter, and my mother-in-law nodded slightly. That was when something inside me shifted too. Not just my arms, something deeper. A small voice began whispering, "You don't know what you're doing. You need to be corrected. You need to be taught how to be a wife, how to be a mother." That moment wasn't a test. It was the beginning of the test. I was too weary to defend myself. The sleep deprivation alone would have left me vulnerable. But paired with the physical pain, the hormonal chaos, the weight of responsibility for a tiny human, I had no reserves left. When my mother-in-law questioned my choices, something in me crumpled. Instead of trusting my instincts, I began doubting them. When she implied I was doing something wrong, I believed her. And in that belief, I began watching myself the way she was watching me. I started evaluating whether I was a good enough wife. Was I recovering quickly enough? Was my house clean enough? Was my baby content enough? Were my clothes modest enough? The questions accumulated like the laundry I couldn't keep up with, and I sank lower beneath them. A few days into her visit, I remembered something my cousin had told me years ago. She'd gotten married before me and had a baby before me. When I was still single and naive, she'd mentioned that her mother-in-law had been difficult in those early weeks. I didn't understand what she meant then. Now I did. She had lived through something like this too. The realization was strange. It made me feel less alone and more afraid at the same time. If this was happening to everyone, then maybe it was supposed to happen. Maybe it was normal. Maybe I was supposed to suffer through it and come out the other side as a real wife, whatever that meant. I remember thinking, so this is what happens. This is the price of becoming a woman in our community. What was my mother-in-law actually testing? That was the question I couldn't answer. Competence, loyalty, my willingness to be remade into someone's idea of a good wife, my worthiness of the man I'd married. Something about my body, about whether I was ready to be a wife again in the way a wife was supposed to be. The ambiguity was almost worse than direct accusation. If she had said, "You must do this," I could have either done it or refused. But instead, she suggested, she implied, she questioned, and in that space between her words and my interpretation, I became my own interrogator. I didn't need her to tell me I was failing. I could tell myself that I was doing her job for her. The days began to blur together. My mother-in-law's comments accumulated like snow. "You should be more active by now. The baby shouldn't sleep so much. Your husband looks tired. You must be wearing him out." Each comment, individually small, felt dismissible, but together they formed a pattern, a judgment, an evaluation. I found myself tracking her reactions to everything I did. Did she approve of how I changed my daughter's diaper, how I bathed her, how I dressed? The postpartum bleeding continued, heavier some days than others, and my mother-in-law's presence around that, offering help with the laundry, commenting on the stains, made me feel less like a new mother and more like a failed version of a woman. By the second week, something had shifted in me. I had stopped believing in my own judgment entirely. When my body said I needed rest, I pushed through it because my mother-in-law implied that resting was self-indulgent. When my instincts told me to hold my baby one way, I second-guessed myself. I began to wonder if my mother-in-law would ever leave. She hadn't said when she was going. She just kept saying she wanted to make sure I was really ready before she went back home. Ready for what? I didn't ask. I was afraid of the answer. I was afraid that no matter what I did, how clean I kept the house, how quickly I healed, how perfectly I performed the role of dutiful wife and devoted mother, it would never be enough. It would never be over. But I was wrong about that. The test wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the third week, the testing had grown teeth. My mother-in-law's comments were no longer suggestions. They were statements. "You're looking pale. A good wife should have more color in her face by now. Is that how you hold a baby in our community? It looks awkward. Your husband seems tired. You must not be managing the house properly." Each observation carried the same weight. "Are you enough?" And the answer, whispered back to me through her eyes, was always no. I wasn't pale enough or rosy enough. I wasn't motherly enough or wifely enough. I wasn't recovering quickly enough or moving carefully enough. There was no version of me that satisfied the measuring stick she held, and the more I tried to adjust myself to meet it, the more impossible it became. Then came the questions about my body, not directly, but wrapped in concern. "When do you think you'll be ready to resume your duties as a wife?" she asked one afternoon while folding laundry. My face went hot. She was asking about intimacy, about when I'd be healed enough to have my husband inside me again, framed as a practical question, but it felt like surveillance. She began asking subtle things. "How is your bleeding? Is it slowing down? Your stitches must be uncomfortable still. When do you think they'll feel normal? You should be ready soon, shouldn't you?" These questions were disguised as maternal concern, but what I felt was my wounded body being assessed, evaluated, prepared for use. She was checking to see if I was ready to be a wife again. Not the emotional kind, but the physical kind, the kind that required my body to serve. My husband was present through all of this, but he was caught. He loved me, I think, but he also respected his mother in a way that superseded his loyalty to me. It was the Amish way. Honor your mother and father. That commandment didn't have an expiration date just because you'd gotten married. So when his mother questioned my choices, he didn't defend me. When she implied I wasn't doing enough, he didn't contradict her. He just looked sad and tired, which somehow made it worse. Because then I felt responsible for his sadness too. I felt like I was failing him by not being what his mother thought I should be. The weight of that, trying to prove myself worthy to a woman while my husband watched from somewhere in between, was crushing. I didn't ask for his help because I knew he couldn't give it. In our world, a wife navigated these things alone. The breaking point came on a day I can still see clearly. My daughter hadn't slept well the night before. I was running on nothing. My mother-in-law came into the kitchen where I was trying to feed her, and she looked at my baby, and then at me with an expression I can only describe as judgment. A baby shouldn't be this fussy, she said. You must be anxious. Babies feel their mother's anxiety. I lost something in that moment, not my temper. I was too exhausted for rage, but some part of my ability to absorb blame without breaking. I looked at my mother-in-law and I said quietly, my baby is not fussy because of me. She's fussy because she's a baby. That's what babies do. The words were simple, not unkind, but they were a boundary, and the moment I spoke them, everything changed. My mother-in-law's face went cold. She left the kitchen without responding, but the silence that followed was deafening. I knew I had failed the test or passed it, depending on how you looked at it. The implications were suddenly clear. If I resisted, if I maintained my own judgment, if I refused to accept her authority, then I had chosen defiance over submission. And defiance meant I wasn't a good wife. Defiance meant I was proud. Defiance meant I wasn't teachable. She became distant after that moment, polite but distant. She still moved through our house, but the warmth she'd performed, the maternal concern, evaporated. What replaced it was a coolness that said, you've made your choice. Now live with the consequences. I thought about the women in our community who hadn't passed their tests, women who had resisted their mother-in-laws, or spoken up too loudly or maintained boundaries that the older generation found threatening. What happened to them? They became women the community whispered about. Women who were difficult or too independent or not submissive. Women whose marriages were quietly judged as struggling, even if they weren't. Women who had proven they couldn't be trusted with the sacred role of wife. That was the real consequence of failing. Not abuse, we didn't have words for that. Just a subtle social exclusion. A sense that you had chosen yourself over your family, and that choice marked you. I understood this suddenly in that kitchen, with my mother-in-law's silence pressing down on me. The test had never been about competence. It had been about something much deeper. But somewhere in that third week, something shifted in me that I didn't expect. I was so exhausted that I stopped fighting, not in a surrendering way, but in a releasing way. I was so tired of trying to prove myself worthy that I just stopped. And in that stopping, something strange happened. I began to see my mother-in-law differently, not as a villain. I'd never had the luxury of that simplicity, but as a woman who had also been tested, a woman who had survived her own mother-in-law's scrutiny, her own postpartum vulnerability, her own questions about whether she was enough. She had learned to navigate this system by becoming the keeper of its rules, by testing younger women the way she'd been tested, by maintaining the hierarchy, because that was the only way she'd survived it. It didn't excuse what she was doing, but it explained something. Both things were true at once. Her behavior was real and it hurt, and she was also trapped in the same system that was trapping me. That understanding changed everything. I stopped trying to pass her test because I realized the test was never actually about me. It was about her need to pass down what had been passed to her, to prove that the system worked, to ensure that I would one day test my own daughter-in-law the same way and the cycle would continue. And in that moment, I made a choice. Not a defiant one, a quiet one. I decided I would be a wife and a mother on my own terms, within the boundaries of my faith and my community, but not at the cost of my own knowing. I began to trust my body again, my instincts, my love for my daughter. I stopped apologizing for recovering at my own pace. I stopped asking permission to be whole. It wasn't a confrontation. It was just a slow return to myself, and my mother-in-law felt it. The testing stopped. Her visit ended shortly after. There was no resolution, no apology, no conversation about what had happened, just a quiet understanding that I had survived, that I had learned, that I would never be the woman she wanted me to be, and I was going to be okay with that.